Welcome, everybody. You're in absolutely the right room because we have free mimosas and waffles coming. Okay, I made that up, but you're in the right room because this is an amazing panel that we're going to interact with. And when I say interact, it really means you. We're going to leverage the wisdom of this room. I'm David Bennell. I'll get to a little bit about me in a minute. And I'm practicing having my mic very close. Good. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional land of the Seminole and other tribes. And this is really important because we're lucky enough to be on a panel with some very smart, hardworking people from indigenous areas and indigenous peoples. So we haven't been doing a lot of this, I think, this week, but let's just acknowledge who came here before us and also who's represented on the panel. Happy International Women's Day. Do you notice anything about the people on this panel, particularly if I went like this? Okay, this is the barely manel panel. Anybody know what a manel is? Yeah, so male panels. And I mean, in a way, that's intentional, but more importantly, these are the right people to have this conversation today. So you're in the right place in the right time with the right folks. But an acknowledgement too to happy International Women's Day. So the run of show is I'll talk for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to get out of the way as your moderator. We'll have each person do a 4-minute introduction. The only thing that I might do that feels mean is if it's 5 to 6 minutes, you'll be going like this, just so we can honor the flow of this and to keep it absolutely conversational. I'll tee up some questions that folks know I'm going to tee up, sort of bigger questions, and then we're going to get into Q&A. As we were joking about, do we ever get over being in third grade and being shy about asking a question? There really aren't any stupid questions. The gift that Aspen has created in 60 plus years, I think, is creating community like this where you can disagree on things or have different points of view. But I'd ask, just like we've agreed as a panel, you can disagree, but please don't be disagreeable. There's a way to have these conversations, so let's agree to have it that way, the good way. I want to acknowledge B. Kuipers, who's sitting on the floor. You have to get up, B. B is the architect of this panel, among others. And I just want to acknowledge again the folks from Aspen, super talented crew and just an amazing event. I'm David Bennell. I'm representing Transformational Investing in Food Systems. Rex Raymond, the executive director, is here. If you have any questions about us, please do ask. My background that's relevant to this panel is I first started down the road of forest-related work when I worked for LL Bean back when that company was sending 400 million catalogs a year. 400 million catalogs a year. And it's public knowledge now, we didn't know necessarily where our paper was coming from. And because I was head of R&D, I got called into the chairman and CEO's office, Ella Bean's grandson, and told to not just figure it out, but fix it. I'm not sure I ever fixed it, but it opened up Pandora's box in a good way for me. And I never had the title that Alison Taylor, who you'll meet in a couple of minutes, had, but I sort of became the de facto leader of what would be called now the sustainability work at the company. From there, I was lucky enough to give some of the Rockefeller family fortune away, funding work in 12 different countries. It's called the FSC Global Fund. So I've been lucky enough to work in some of the places these amazing people that you hear from live and work. And I've also had the kind of experience where people like me show up who look like me and get detained at gunpoint because I didn't come in the right way or it was misunderstood why I was there. So serious stuff with serious people who have a lot of important things to teach us. I'm going to invite you. There are a couple of seats. You're not going to be disruptive. If you don't want to stand, there are 2 in the front row, 2 in the second row, a couple in the third row. You're not going to bother us. Unless you're Mirta, who I'm going to call on. Hi, Mirta. Good morning. Thank you for coming. And so let me tee this up. So I think it was Sylvie or Belén, one of these amazing people reminded me yesterday, we know a fair amount about the issue. A couple of people on the panel live in the places where this is a massive issue. We're all part of it. But I was reminded not everybody knows what really the scale of this is. So a couple of things. About 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions are driven by deforestation and land conversion. Global tree cover loss reached about 25 million hectares in 2021. I don't have 22 numbers yet, but that's the size of the UK. And that number has doubled in the last 20 years. So we deforest and change significantly the land, the equivalent of the UK, every year. I mean, I think you know most of these things. They're kind of horrifying. The global food systems are responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of this land change is driven by all of us who eat. Raise your hand if you eat. Okay, so we're all part of this. And more than half the world's GDP, that's 44 trillion of economic value generations, either moderately or highly reliant on nature and the services it provides. So while we talk about climate, and as well we should, it's so inextricably linked. So when we talk about systems, it really is about systems. So those are just a couple of stats to ground it. You're welcome to find any of these experts or me afterwards, and we can blow your mind a little bit more. We've agreed that this isn't going to be, I love that if you were lucky enough to join the plenary yesterday on climate doom, this isn't, we don't want to deforestation doom you. Our job is to daylight things, and we're all going to try and give good examples of things that are happening that are making a difference so that you don't leave looking for that mimosa I falsely promised you. So Sylvie, do you mind getting us started? Give us 4 or so minutes on your organization, your work, and your lived experience in this amazing conversation and world we're living in.
Thank you, David, for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Sylvie Djacbou Deugoue, and I'm a Greenpeace Africa forest campaigner. I'm based in Cameroon. I grew up in one of the large forests in the world, the Congo Basin Forest. And the forest was more than my home. It was my playground. Like, getting lost in the forest was a real adventure for me. And the same forest was like a source of livelihood for me. We will go there with my brother family to collect non-timber forest products, as well as collect traditional medicine for our treatment. And not only that, the forest served me as a free therapy session. I didn't have to pay as today. So when I was sad or I needed to reflect, I would go under a tree and enjoy the shadow of the branches and the singing of the bird, the squirrel climbing the tree, and so on. And it was giving me a peace of mind. The life seemed so simple, right? But and that tranquil environment was reflecting in the unity of the community. But unfortunately, growing up, I witnessed the consequence of deforestation for the large-scale land agriculture and logging. So the humid rainforest rapidly changed to dry, more in some area, depending on the intensity of the logging. So the rich life that was there rapidly changed to the story of displacement of indigenous community and the fleet of wildlife. So I then decided to join the forest campaign 9 years ago to protect one of the remaining carbon sinks on the earth, the Congo Basin Forest, the lungs of Africa. And by doing so, I work at 3 levels. I work to defend the right of indigenous and local community. I advocate also for stronger forest policy in the Congo Basin. I also portray alternative development solution, but I also work at the level of investor for responsive investment and shifting investment from company involved in deforestation to community-based initiatives that are responsible for environment. And to do all that, I need to document and expose land grabbing, deforestation, and all the illegality going on around. So it's a pleasure for me to be there. Thank you.
standing room only. It's not just the mimosas and waffles that got you here. Sylvie, thank you. You can read everything that you want to know about these folks starting with the app. So rather than take up time telling you who people are, listen to who they are. And if you want to read more, just check it out. Carly, over to you.
Thank you, Bea and David, for organizing this conversation. So, hello, everyone. My name is Carly Jacobs. I am here to represent an investor point of view. And noticing how many younger professionals or people who are maybe pre-professional career who are here, I was reflecting on what I thought about the world when I was in those positions. And honestly, before I got in this field, I thought investors were soulless, boring, pencil pushers, like not a sexy field that I ever thought I would be in. I was going to be a lawyer. But I was studying environmental studies in college as well as economics. And I landed in this field actually by way of an internship. I interned for this group called KLD Research and Analytics. They were a very early research provider for what was at that point called the socially responsible investment industry. They were creating research products to help investors make decisions based on environmental and social impacts. And I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, money talks. And that internship was really eye-opening for me because I realized there was a niche in this world where the money was talking for good. They were talking for things that I care deeply about, including environmental sustainability and social justice. So after that internship, I was like, lawyer who? That was no longer my path. I really tried to gear my studies intentionally to being in the field that I'm currently in. So after KLD, I went to an investment management shop. I was there for 10 years. At that point, I was an analyst, and I also worked on shareholder engagement. In the analyst position, essentially, I was looking at, is there anything in the ESG, environmental social governance realm of information that could either sweeten or sour the investment thesis that we were making on the stocks we were picking? And then on the stewardship side or the shareholder engagement side, and this was the coolest part of my job at that time, I was looking at, okay, once we've made that investment decision, that's not it. We don't just park our money and then walk away. We are going to be active owners. We're going to encourage the companies to adopt different practices, different policies, to become more transparent. And it was just incredible to see the impact that investors could have on real companies that are out there. Following my approximately 10 years with that investment shop, I moved to Central Pennsylvania, and I started working for the Hershey Company. I was the Hershey Company's first hire to work on environmental sustainability. So I had the fun of learning how to measure a greenhouse gas footprint from scratch. And then once we have that baseline footprint, setting a science-based greenhouse gas reduction goal. I also helped Hershey make relationships with the Science Based Targets Network because after climate change, really wanted to look at how can we embrace science-based methodologies to other environmental systems, including water, land use, forests, so on. Hershey was eye-opening for me because I realized I actually really like the investment side. Again, those boring soulless people who I once thought I was like, I am officially not one of them. So after 2 years at Hershey, I wanted to come back to my home industry, which I consider to be investment, and I joined the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. So the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, I'm going to call it PRI or UNPRI for short. We are the largest global initiative on responsible investment. So we have over 5,300 global signatories with a collective 121 trillion in assets under management. Those individuals represent people who are all over the spectrum of responsible investment. So we have leaders who are doing really amazing, really innovative things. We have, I would say, a good portion of our signatories are the middle. So I kind of call us like the 200-pound gorilla. We have just such heft of investors who are starting to think about and struggle with these issues and figuring out what they should be doing. And then we have those who are at the beginning of their phase and are really getting started in this field. So we pride ourselves on being a big tent. At the UNPRI, I'm specifically working on stewardship, so trying to get all those 5,300 signatories to do a little bit more in terms of pushing the things that they are investing in, whether that be fixed income instruments, which would be bonds, whether that be companies, so on and so forth, real estate, other projects, towards sustainable outcomes, including environmental sustainability, social justice, and so on and so forth. So my role here today, I can come at this issue from an analyst position, from a company position. We have another company, which is great, but really here to speak for what are investors doing? Why is this issue an investment issue? And that will be, if you walk away from anything here, I hope that it is that deforestation is an investment issue that investors need to care about. And I'll unpack that hopefully later. And then also what PRI as a convener is doing to try and motivate more investors to do something on this and be part of the solution. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Carly. Not all investors are evil. Carly's a good example of that. So am I. Hopefully you'll feel that way at the end. Belén, do you want to take over for us? 4 minutes on you.
Sure,
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Belén from Ecuador. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. I'm Belén Páez. I am from Ecuador, and I'm really pleased and honored to be here with you today. Thank you, Dave, and everyone to organize this panel, and I'm so thrilled to share some of our experiences in the Amazon region. I'm also really moved because Dave mentioned and acknowledged the elders, the indigenous peoples from these lands. And perhaps I will say that over the last 26 years now working in the Amazon, I've been really moved from not just the indigenous peoples, the research that I have been doing, the advocacy or public policies that I have been involved, but also I'm being really involved with this close relation with nature, with the Amazon, with the forests, with the rivers, with the animals, with the trees. And that perspective, that connection, that really touching my heart. So I moved from working always in my mind and even in my heart all the time. I've been running, I've been on the front lines, I've been a really active activist. But so far, after 25 years now, I see that I'm more settled, and I'm here to share about from that place, that place that is a lot of the knowledge and the acknowledge I have from the indigenous wisdom and from the forest itself. So Fundación Pachamama, which I am the president of Fundación Pachamama in Ecuador, has been working in Ecuador and Peru also for several decades. And I'm also the Secretariat General of the initiative that is called the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, that is aimed to permanent protect a really vast region in the forest for over 35 million hectares. It's a very large place on Earth. And you already heard that the Congo Basin, the Delta Niger, Indonesia, Madagascar, but especially the tropical rainforest, the Amazon, is the most important forest for the climate stability in the planet nowadays. This ecosystem is, maybe you might know, but during the Pleistocene, when the glaciation happened millions of years ago, the Amazon were not under the waters. And what happened there is that the creation of a lot of connections in between nature and all these species that were alive at that time, they were developing all this intelligence that is still remaining until now. And that's why the Amazon Basin is one of these places where the highest biodiversity spots on Earth are in existence. And maybe 15,000 years ago, indigenous people, maybe more, there are like some studies that shows that maybe 17,000 years ago, indigenous people already have been populating in this area, and they have developed these skills, this understanding, this knowledge to see and to understand how the forest thinks, and how these connections and this knowledge about the plants, about how to build relations with the spirits from the forest has been changing the way that they are looking the natural world in this moment. So what we have been doing so far is working with indigenous peoples in the front lines, not just to protect their human rights, their collective rights, but also the rights of nature. In Ecuador, we were the first organization involved to rewrite the Constitution of Ecuador to include the rights of nature in the Constitution of Ecuador. And nowadays, after 12 years, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature has been expanding the work of rights of nature around the world. But this has been happening because this close relation with the Amazon. And also the 80% of the biodiversity around the world is in the hands of indigenous peoples, in their territories, in their lands. So this is a very important fact that we must know. And also the 47% of the Amazon region is in Latin America, in these 9 countries that are the Amazon basin. So far, the 25% of that the Amazon has been gone. It's not already in existence. And there are some drivers that also you might know that comes through these industrial activities as mining, large-scale mining, oil development, agro-industry, land use change, dams. And I will tell you more maybe in the next round, but the Amazon is under danger and our climate stability is also very in danger and peril.
Thank you, Belén. So I was not in the AV club in high school, but I'm told to give you that one. And could you give your mic to Belén? Let's see if this works.
Oh,
we're so compliant.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Taylor. I'm Chief Sustainability Officer for ADM. Some of you might have known the company as Archer Daniels Midland, but we go by ADM for short now. For International Women's Day, I want to give a shout out to my mom, who's the reason I'm here and the reason I do what I do. My mom, whom I wish was here, but I hope she'll be able to watch a recording later, is a retired biology teacher. And she really inspired me through my life as I was lucky enough to go out on collection trips with her when we would get leaves and bugs and things to bring to her classroom. And it was a big treat for me to be able to work on the bulletin boards in her classroom. I don't even know if they have those anymore, but we would use construction paper and things like that. And it was really an inspiration to me to have a mom who was so committed to teaching young people about the environment. And the way in which she would tell me about the environment was how everything is interconnected. And so I may not have known the word ecosystem when I was that young, but I've really heard her words and her example through most of my career and pursued the systematic way of looking at the environment and how so many players have to collaborate, human and species have to collaborate in order to preserve and enhance biodiversity. And it's really important to talk about climate in those terms, and I appreciate your bringing that out, David, that biodiversity and species and the environment and nature are so much of what we're talking about, and climate is a part of that, of course, as well. I do work for a company now. I worked as an environmental lawyer and then as a policy person on Capitol Hill for a lot of years. We used to get things done a little different these days, I think, but that's where I learned about different points of view, and in many ways that's a system as well of decision making and environmental policy. And then I decided that having worked in a company that was energy and infrastructure oriented, I really wanted to go into the agriculture sector. Frankly, I thought that the agriculture sector had kind of been missed. There's a lot of attention on energy and the emissions, especially from the climate point of view, from the energy sector. But I saw that there was a lot of work to be done in the agriculture sector. And I like food. So I went to ADM and have been working not only with a food company, I learn, but also a company that knows a lot about bio-based everything, which has become extremely relevant, particularly in the past years. So what ADM does, think of us in the middle of the agriculture value chain. ADM doesn't own any farms, and ADM doesn't own brands that you go to the grocery store and see. But think of ADM as an ingredient provider. So ADM is dependent upon nature and dependent upon the communities of growers around the world who are growing row crops, wheat, soy, corn, palm, but also vanilla, mint, huito fruit, which is a natural blue coloring. And we're dependent on those crops, and we're dependent on nature that supports those crops, and also the farmers. And certainly there are some areas where we are sourcing, that's buying crops, that are at risk for deforestation. The Amazon, no doubt, outside of the Amazon as well. Southeast Asia, these are areas where deforestation is a significant risk. We've mapped all of our supply chains for these risks, and we have policies and sourcing policies that we'll talk about a little more specifically in these areas. We also have worked a lot with other companies in our sector, and I don't represent them here, but I'd also like to talk about what a lot of companies are doing with respect to deforestation, because I think it's important to bring out how many of us are trying to speak with one voice, talking to growers around the world and our customers as well. If we've all got different standards, if we're defining forest in different ways, if we're approaching deforestation in different ways, it's very confusing. And so we found that having a common definition and understanding of a forest, which will have to vary from biome to biome around the world, but having that common understanding is very important. Conveying that clearly is very important. And measuring our progress, especially for investors, we are a publicly traded company at ADM, is also very important. So we've had a policy in place for no deforestation since 2015. And I want to say, very importantly, a part of that policy is no exploitation of human rights. It's in the same policy. And we also have a separate policy for human rights in areas that aren't associated with deforestation. And we refreshed that policy in 2021 to reflect that there's not only more technology and so more that we can do. We accelerated our no deforestation date by 5 years to 2025, due in large part to the technology that's available to us now. And we've also refreshed it to include biodiversity more specifically, not only preserving biodiversity, but enhancing that. So I look forward to talking to all of you more about that. Thanks.
So, B, where are you going? No, I'm just kidding. I've always wanted to do that to somebody. So you should be rehearsing questions right now, right? Because I won't call on you. I do know some of you. But be rehearsing your questions, because we're going to make this quite interactive, including me walking around with a microphone in just a little bit. And there are no stupid questions. How you ask the question is important. But there aren't any stupid questions. So Sylvie, what's the biggest single challenge around deforestation in the Congo Basin? And how do you sort of look to the future there? Hope and be hopeful.
Thank you, David. I think from the perspective of the Congo Basin, where I work, the bigger challenge is the narrative around deforestation, the narrative that we cannot develop without trashing forests, while the promise of development through deforestation has never served the people living there. You have to see the reality on the ground. Maybe exporting timber can help increase the GDP, but the life on the ground, the development on the ground does not follow. So I think we should change the narrative that we cannot develop without deforestation. The second point I want to add is that is big challenge of deforestation are the law and regulation. The policy in the Congo Basin contain a lot of loopholes that allow deforestation, that allow community to be chased away from their land, and those are why we are working to make sure that the customary rights of indigenous and local community are properly included in the regulation and in the law. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvie. Carly, I'm not skipping you. I mean, I'm going to come to you, but I want to piggyback to Belén for a minute. Belén, you put out a statistic that I didn't know, and it kind of is mind-blowing that 80% of biodiversity is on the lands of indigenous peoples. Okay. There are a couple of things you should probably remember when you walk out the room. That's probably one of them. So how do in indigenous territories, how do we ensure indigenous rights, ensure the biodiversity that we all depend on? I mean, I know you could take weeks to answer that and still not feel like it was answered, but in a couple of minutes, can you respond to that?
I don't know, but how about you? But I've been participating for over 2 decades in the climate change conventions and the biodiversity conventions at the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples Affairs. And there are like very specific recommendations that we all need to do and implement. So first of all is ensuring collective rights, indigenous rights, to acknowledge and to include in our public policies, constitutions, the indigenous rights. Secondly, is very important to enhance participation of indigenous peoples on developing public policies on forest conservation, financial mechanisms, adaptation. Then there is a huge task and challenge to increase capacity building in the next 5 years, 10 years, of youth, indigenous peoples being able to negotiate these public policies, being in charge to deal with the carbon credit brokers, not brokers. They want to negotiate their own credits with the investors. So that's the thing, like carbon credits, biodiversity credits, technology for conservation. Indigenous people are going to be leading in the next decade their own projects. So they want to avoid people who's in the medium. And I'm saying this because for over decades, the indigenous people has been facing violation of their rights in their territories, and they really need to go. The other thing that I would like to mention is that consultation, free prior consultation is a must. So in any kind of project, could be a road, the development of a road or a mining company coming into their territories, oil development, land use change, they must need to be consulted. And if they said no, the prior free consent will allow them to tell to the government that this is not the way that they want to go. And finally, what I would like to say is that we need to have a permanent protection of the Amazon region, because our climate stability depends on the situation of the Amazon.
Thank you, Belén. Beautifully said. So, Carly, I told you I wasn't going to skip you. So, most investors I know are actually humans. Some are robots. Some are, yeah. So, I think we might know why deforestation matters to the investor human being thing. But why does this matter? What is it about, without getting too into materiality or but what is it that matters if you're an investor related to deforestation?
Sure. And actually, a quick show of hands, is anyone here an investor or working at an investment management firm? Okay, great. Fantastic. Hopefully what I say is still entertaining for you, but for everyone else, just to kind of distill real quickly what the role that most investors are doing is they're looking at an investment opportunity and assessing the risk and opportunities of that opportunity and deciding whether or not for them it makes sense to invest in that asset, because it's either going to help them deliver upon a client's objective or their own firm's objective. And so basically what that means is anytime an investor is making a decision, they're weighing out risk and opportunities as well as an entity's potential ability to manage those risks to decide whether the juice is worth the squeeze for them. And so when you look at deforestation, it's almost all risk. And I'm going to name out 5 different risks for you that deforestation presents to investors and why this is a crucial issue to investors. So the first comes down to operational risk. So you would think because of how much deforestation is occurring that this must be good for the economy, even though it sucks for people on the planet. The truth is it's not even good for the economy. When an organization deforests, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot in terms of their long-term productivity. So there's countless examples of this in a bunch of different commodities that deforest. I'm going to bring it a little bit closer to a commodity I feel comfortable talking about, which is cocoa. And when I was working at Hershey, we learned that cocoa actually grows best in a shaded environment, meaning that cocoa grows best in a forested environment. Whether it was because of blind capitalism or maybe that insight got lost over the years, we don't know. But a lot of the world's cocoa these days is not grown in the most optimal environment for it, which leads to this negative feedback loop where year after year your cocoa trees are producing less cocoa, and so then potentially you have farmers who are deforesting more land to plant more cocoa, and the cycle repeats. So operational inefficiencies is one risk. The second is legal risk. So this was really cool news. I don't know if it hit anyone's radar here, but in January of this year has not gone on that long, but in January of this year, the EU passed an agreement that come next year, they are going to ban any import of any product that has deforestation origins, which means we might potentially see companies producing products without a market to sell it into. Econ 101, supply demand. If you can't get your product to market, what's the point? And so that's creating a lot of legal risk for companies that currently have that in their model. Additionally, too, we believe the EU model is going to be copied, so it's going to chase itself around the globe, that rise to the top. My organization, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, we commissioned a body of research called the Inevitable Policy Response. And this is essentially looking at governments around the world's policy responses to climate change. So it's a climate change model, but rather than looking at like what does it take to get to 1.5 or what does it take to get to a certain degree goal, it's actually looking at what is the likely impacts or the likely channel that governments around the world are going to be following. And that IPR model is also unique because it includes land use change. And what the IPR model found was that companies that do deforestation, companies that have these land use risks, are at risk of losing 30% of their value. So think about that. If you invested $100 in 7 years, you would have $70. That's not the investment return channel that most investors are looking to make. So that legal risk component is another part of it. Innovation risk. And I hope everyone was at the plenary yesterday and saw Michael Green speak about the buildings of the future, the architecture of the future. And one of the things out there is that this premise is that forests, biodiversity, provide amazing innovation achievement. So his project was a lot about looking at trees and how they are supporting large structures. There's this other story, and honestly, I read it years ago before we even really knew that fake news is a thing. So I'm going to present it as potentially it's a wise tale, potentially it's a true story. But I do remember hearing this story as well about pharmaceutical companies that found a really promising organic compound that looked like it would actually have great appeal to counter cancer. And they found it in the last tree of its kind. Like basically they found it right as that tree went extinct. And so there's so many different things like this where potentially under the hood, there is innovations in pharmaceuticals, there's innovations in materials, there's innovations in other sectors I'm probably not even naming out here. And by blind deforestation, we're throwing out a lot of future potential innovations for our societies. One more item, the reason why this is material or significant to investors is climate change. This is a feel fact, but I do feel pretty darn confident in it. I feel that we can say that investors, by and large right now, understand that climate change is important. And we could probably spend an entire session just on that, but to really distill it down into a couple of components for you. When investors are, beyond the quarterly calls of whether or not a certain company is going to lose or a certain company is going to be a winner that quarter, when you zoom out to the macro lens, essentially all investment returns are looking at economic returns. So GDP is a really important macro long-term indicator of what's going to be possible for investors. And researchers around the world have been looking at what is the likely effect of climate change. I'm going to quote one study, but there's many others out there. So in 2018, Oxford University put out a study that says 1.5 degrees Celsius is essentially the last temperature rung where GDP growth today looks the same in the future. At 2 degrees and every degree after that, GDP starts going radical. And so that study showed that there was about a 2% medium impact of GDP decline. I know that doesn't sound huge, but when you're talking of trillions of dollars of global wealth, 2% is a lot. And so this is something that really matters to investors in terms of their long-term growth. The other thing too, though, is forests, I'm going a little long, aren't I? Real quickly, forests are a huge carbon sink, and I'm sure that is something everyone here knows. I learned that when I was at Hershey, that when you deforest, that also has incredible climate impacts. Oftentimes, the deforestation event itself is very carbon emitting, and then you're eradicating something that used to be pulling carbon out of the air. So for about 20 years, you're going to be feeling that impact of that deforestation event. Forests also control weather. And interestingly enough, I listened to an audiobook over my winter break, which scared the living bejesus out of me. But essentially, it talked about the fact that at a certain point, if you deforest enough of a forest, it ceases to become a carbon sink and actually becomes a carbon emitter. So one of our biggest allies in this fight against climate change could equally be turned to the dark side, which we don't want to see. And it's starting. I will let the other esteemed colleagues talk about this, but investors are also increasingly caring about indigenous rights and human rights. And so I'm glad that I have other experts here to talk about that, but I would say that's the fifth round out of why this is an issue that matters to investors.
Thanks, Carly. And Sylvie, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Carly. I think I have a different perspective from the investor. I'm really happy that I have in the panel people working with investor. Most of the company linked to the deforestation in the Congo Basin are linked with investor. And for the past 9 years, I've been campaigning against deforestation. One thing that come out was that those investors really doesn't care if the company are involved in deforestation or in land grabbing. Why am I saying so? There are numerous companies, and one of them that I'm currently working on, which has received the fund from an investor. The investor has the sustainability policy, which say the company doesn't have to link to the deforestation. The company doesn't have to involve in the land grabbing. Like the company have to respect the FPIC, free, prior, and insane conflict, but on the ground, it's totally the contrary that's happening. And each of the company I've been working on has been having that same valuation of the sustainability policy of the investor, but the investor doesn't care. The only moment those investors has decided to pull out the investment or to step back is when we have named them and shamed them with the correct information and data that is happening on the ground. And that's why I really want to say, I think it's time for the people working in the investment sector to really put out a true mechanism that really track the application of the sustainability policy up to the ground, so that we are so that the deforestation does not like increase and going on. And most of the time, when we even track those timber, I'm happy because you talk about the EU forest regulation. This is something I've been campaigning for a year with my colleague and other organizations. And we managed to have the rubber involved as a commodity at risk linked to the deforestation. But for that, we needed to show what is happening on the ground. Maybe for me, on the paper, on the document, maybe far from DC, from UK or everywhere, they receive maybe different report or they have the policy. But on the ground, I'm sorry to say that this is not what is happening on the ground. And indigenous community are suffering. They are getting more and more poor. The seasons are really changing. When you come to Cameroon, for instance, now, we were supposed to be in the raining season, but it's so dried. The community lost all their livelihood, and investors are still granting the fund. Currently, there are one company that, despite the fact that we have shown the evidence that the company that is operating on the ground is not respecting, has violated the sustainability policy and the local law, they want to grant the second, they want to give them the second part of the grant. And for sure, we're going to name and shame them and expose them. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvie. So, Alison, will you take us to Q&A? So get ready, because I'm going to ask you to start raising your hands. I know that you spend a lot of time educating investors, and I think it's sort of an interest on deforestation, among other things. So is there anywhere you'd like to sort of touch on what's just been teed up?
I think that there's some really important and detailed questions that investors should be asking companies. And as a company that puts a lot of energy, effort, and money into no deforestation policies, implementation of them on the ground, it's really important that we see other companies doing the same, because one company can't do it all. We're not even in a lot of supply chains like cocoa or animals. So we need the cooperation among many companies that could have an effect on deforestation. One important question to ask is, do you know your supply chains? Do you know the farmers from whom you are sourcing? That's called traceability for a lot of people who are kind of steeped in the lingo. And companies are publishing, many companies are publishing their traceability numbers, the percent of their supply chains that they can trace back to the farm. And that should be a part of their financial disclosures. It should be a part of their sustainability reports. We report ours every 6 months as well, as we're making progress. Companies should also report on how they are monitoring their supply chain. So it's not just knowing who the farmers are from whom you're sourcing or other types of land activities, but it's also what's happening. So satellite imagery, I mentioned that there's technology developments that are very important, and even AI. These are tools that we use. Investors can use them, NGOs use them as well. And that tells us whether something has changed on the property from which we were sourcing or we're about to source. And we can literally look at that on iPads and make those decisions in real time. What we typically do is engage the farmer, engage the grower. We don't necessarily want to kick everybody out of a supply chain if we can actually educate them and bring them into better practices. It's important for their livelihood. And so that's why we've seen some deforestation rates in areas declining, because of that education, because of those common expectations, and the fact that they're aware that we're using technology to see what they're doing. And I think that's something that you can, as an investor, ask companies, as a consumer, ask companies. Do they know their supply chains, and how are they monitoring them? As for biodiversity and monitoring and enhancing biodiversity, there's some new financial reporting standards that are being worked on right now. And I think everyone can be watching financial reports, especially for publicly traded companies, to see if they are looking at these standards and guidelines and if they're implementing them. It's hard to figure out what's a baseline of biodiversity. That's a very scientific determination. There'll be a lot of people who disagree with that, and we see a lot of really smart people working on mapping of biodiverse areas. We're going to be using those maps, just like we use maps of where indigenous people are located, just like we use satellite imagery to see what's happening on farms. This is becoming a very technology-forward endeavor. And utilizing that technology has really been a game changer for us. So that's why we're able to pull our dates forward for achieving no deforestation. And I'll make one other point about not just deforestation, but conversion of native vegetation. So that is beyond forests. There are a lot of different definitions of forests that we're beginning to harmonize, at least in the agriculture sector. But beneath a forest, if you will, there's native vegetation, there's savannas, there's wetlands, there's other very important areas to ecosystems that can be disturbed through agriculture activity or other activities. Mapping those areas is very important to us as well, because enhancing and maintaining and preserving biodiversity is not all about forests, as important as forests are. So this has become, as I said in the beginning, really about nature. And really about preserving nature, enhancing nature, and the ability to mitigate and reverse climate change through natural processes and natural enhancement.
Sure. And while Belén's commenting, can I see some hands if you're curious? Okay, I'm going to start. I'll channel my inner Oprah and start trying really hard to get some questions in here. Can you make it brief, and we'll then interact with you directly through a question.
Hola. Okay. Okay, so in 2 minutes, what I would like to say is that what we see that is possible now in the Amazon is to create this collaboration, ecosystem of collaboration to enhance bioeconomy, the superpower of bioeconomy, including indigenous peoples, private sector, in local governments, academic sector, and we think this is very viable. And it will affect the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples that are in the front lines defending the forest. As an author of the scientific panel of the Amazon, we present a report 2 years ago in Glasgow, and it's really clear that the temperature in the Amazon will rise to 4 centigrades in the next decade. The Amazon in the south, in Brazil, is going to be run close to a savanna. And the GDP, we are not like talking more about GDP. We are talking about, and we are not just telling that the forest is a carbon sink, because actually it's the hydrological service for the entire continent that affects the economy of each of the big cities in Latin America. So what we are saying is that the forest is the most important and critical ecosystem in the planet to stabilize the rainings in the continent. So we are talking about the well-living index, the health environment indexed. If we want to transit into this new economic that are based in life principles, not in death principles, we really need to see what are the next steps. It's basically not a growing system, but it's a system that allows life on Earth to exist.
Life systems versus death systems. Okay. There's so many people who put their hands up. I'm going to start bidding. $100. We're all here for a little while afterwards, so we're not going to get to remotely anything in terms of the numbers of hands up. So just know we can stick around a little bit. So if you can't get your question asked with the mic, you can ask it in the old-fashioned way in person.
Thank you. My name is Fabian, and I'm with Viridistera. So we've been doing large-scale reforestation projects in the Amazon. I've been in Ecuador with the Secopai tribes, understand the indigenous wisdom and knowledge and the need for them to get back their sovereignty and their voice around the 9 countries of the Amazon. I guess from a technical standpoint, the way we restructure how reforestation was happening was exactly how you said it. It's like, how do you stop deforestation while reforesting? And the root cause of this is indigenous people or whoever owns the land don't have the resources to regenerate their own land. So we came up with something that was a profit share partnership where we raise all the money from large-scale corporation. We developed the project, and we basically create those profit share agreement long-term, and we employ the people on the ground, and we start paying them more money to reforest with biodiversity, their ecosystem, instead of deforesting, slash and burn, or any type of monoculture. And that symbiosity where we get them out of their struggle, essentially, creating value on the ground is what we realize works really, really great. So the question is, right now we're doing 3,000 hectares. We should be doing 40 to 100,000 hectares project at scale, recreating the full biodiversity with agroforestry, silvopastoral, forest plantation, forest preservation. And from an investor standpoint, I realized that the perceived risk is still a huge issue. Like the underwriting timeframes and the investment timeframes are typically not really aligned. These are like, you know. Yeah. So what? How do investors get over the time frame of investments that 10, 15 plus years? How do you bridge the gap on those investments?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I realize we're kind of referring to investors as a monolith. Investors are very multifaceted. And so for certain investors, they're just never going to have the investment mandate to be where you want to be. Other investors will, though. So I think looking at making sure that the investors that you're trying to attract to your investors have the right investment mandate to be able to be in that. Insurance companies are investors too, and they're a very important part of the ecosystem. And so I've seen this in a lot of food system discussions, is like, how can you also be educating the insurers? So I think that's part of it, is just like looking at the right investors, trying to educate everywhere all at once. That would be my response. And actually, since I have the mic, I just wanted to say too, in response to a few comments that have come up here on this panel, is that investors, I think, have been doing a lot of company by company engagement. And the interesting thing is that PRI's view, we're actually thinking that's great, but it's not it's not the best way for investors to be engaging in this. It shouldn't stop. But what PRI is looking at now is how can investors also be engaging with policymakers? Because when you switch policymakers, that's when you get the broad scale impact. So PRI right now is supporting a group called the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation. It's overseen by a group that's also affiliated with the World Economic Forum. And essentially what that group is trying to do.
Can you just stop
Yes.
there, and we're going to have Sylvie respond, and
Okay.
then we have one more question, then we need to cut, and we're going to stick around. Sylvie, you want to respond? Sorry, Carly.
Okay, thank you. So sorry for my campaign background, but I don't want people to go out of the room with the thinking that to end deforestation, we need to do reforestation. For me, tree planting is not a solution. It's just to greenwash our conscience. Because you cannot put a band-aid on a demembrane on an arm that you have already cut. No, for me, that's not a solution. The solution to end deforestation is to change the current economic development model that is rooted in deforestation. That's one. The second one is to make sure that indigenous community and local community are at the table of all decision-making process that is happening. And one of the last thing I also want to point out is that the community, I would say the African community, need to hold their leader accountable for the pledge, because most of the African community are taking the pledge to reduce the emission. For instance, Cameroon, they take the pledge to reduce the emission by 30%, but at the same time, they are granting more forests, almost 400,000 hectares to be deforested. So it's time for us to hold our leader accountable and to tap into indigenous community knowledge to change the policy, to make our policy stronger and change our current economic development model.
Wholeheartedly, and also think that investors can and should be part of the charge to hold policymakers accountable and advocate for new policies. So, full stop.
Okay, I got to tell you, it's 12:29. I don't know how this happened, but it's time to close. I know. So that nice person who I just handed the microphone to, don't walk out with
Okay.
it. But you get the last, can you make it 10-second question
Try.
and then direct it to someone who
Yeah.
maybe hasn't spoken just now?
Awesome. I'm Christina. Belén, it's for you. You commented about the carbon credit space and the indigenous people to be able to develop their projects by themselves. What would be, or how do you see that road when you have all of this very complicated ecosystem with the verifiers like Vera Gold Standard that are doing the road a little bit complicated? It takes forever to get projects launched and very, very expensive to develop.
Bennell, can you,
Yeah.
2 minutes?
Sí.
Close us out in 2
Okay,
minutes?
so in the Amazon basin, every country has different models with public policies, with project developers, but at least in Ecuador, what we see that is possible in the future is to be coming with the Cancun safeguards. No, Cancun safeguard says that indigenous people should be leading their projects, have benefit sharing, do the capacity building in a way that they can really go for the next step. So at the Montreal Biodiversity Convention, the pledges that are coming for stop deforestation and support indigenous peoples in the ground, these fast tracks to support indigenous peoples in the ground, to protect the forest, are not coming very easy. So these things about green funding for climate finances in different countries are happening different things, but I think the next step for everyone is to see indigenous peoples in the front lines able and with the capacity building to negotiate the projects by themselves with the support of the government, but also with the support from the investors.
Perfect answer. I feel like I've just been in one of those Ferraris that runs up and down Collins Avenue, making way too much noise, being part of this amazing panel, if I can say I've been a part of it. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you, and we'll stick around for a little bit. All the best.